Although Bradford has a history going back well over 1,000 years, its reputation as a leading English city was made as recently as the 19th century, when the town was a locus classicus of urban industrial growth. Peel back the veneer of that Victorian city, and we uncover vestiges of a much older community. The place name of Bradford is derived from the Old English brada, meaning broad, and ford, meaning a passage across a stream. Beneath our feet here at Goytside is one of 4 small streams or becks which flow down from the surrounding hills and meet at Bradford. The word Goyt is another word for mill race, the watercourse which drove the medieval water corn mill. For early people, the natural crossing point of a watercourse was important and attracted early clearance and settlement. In a secluded side valley of the River Aire, the site at Bradford presented better natural conditions for defence and was perhaps healthier than the damp, heavily wooded valley of Airedale. The early settlement of timber housing with thatched roofs was probably confined to the area close to the site of the present parish church, a cathedral since 1919, first mentioned in the register of Archbishop Wickwayne in 1281. By 1600, the single-storied timber houses of medieval Bradford had given way to plain, 2-storied houses of stone. The town became a compact little market community of narrow streets and alleys, which climbed steeply up the hill on the west side of the Bradford Beck. The late Tudor town of Bradford was approximately T-shaped. The vertical stem was Kergate, beginning at the valley bottom close to Broadstones and climbing up to the junction of Ivegate and Westgate. To the left of this junction, Ivegate dropped steeply down to the Sun Bridge, and to the right, Westgate ran upwards to Sillsbridge Lane and then into open countryside. This later map of 1722 confirms this triple street arrangement of the small market town's urban core for nearly 500 years. Here today, at the junction of these 3 ancient highways, we're surrounded by numerous chain stores of the 21st century Britain, lots of concrete and glass, all serving the needs of the modern shopper. But just across the way there, the symbol of Bradford's traditional retailing system, the ancient market cross, has found refuge in the foyer of the modern marketplace, only a few yards from its original location on this spot where we stand today. Looking down Kirkgate towards the parish church in 1800, our visitor would have been able to view the recently built manor house with its Georgian facade, fine avenue of walks and beautiful gardens. For a long time this was the house of the Rawson family, but by 1830 this fine house was overrun by Bradford's market and retailing needs, as hawkers, cheapjacks and market stalls of every description occupied its grounds. On the opposite side of the road from the manor house was the Talbot Hotel, which many might remember by its distinctive figure of a bloodhound above the main entrance. This was one of the town's earliest coaching houses, the Union coach calling daily on its run from Leeds to Kendal. It's in the true nature of towns to change, and Bradford is no exception to that rule. Looking around today, these pictures show how the city centre has changed from the paintings and illustrations of the town 200 years ago. That town gave way to an explosion of wealth and economic expansion in Bradford's staple industry, the making of worsted cloth. Between 1770 and 1870, Bradford passed from the status of a small West Yorkshire market town to become the world centre of the woolen and worsted manufacture, a veritable Worstedopolis, as one writer put it. In 1900, a trade correspondent of the Bradford Observer remarked, "If we look around at our mills, our warehouses and our public buildings, it needs no great effort to imagine that Bradford is built of wool." Traditionally, since the 16th century at least, Halifax and the Upper Calder Valley had been the heartland of worsted textile production. However, with the introduction of steam-powered worsted spinning in the 1790s, Bradford began to overtake Halifax as the industry began a gradual transition from domestic and water-powered production to urban steam-powered factory manufacture. Thanks to a plentiful supply of cheap local coal and the development of engine-making ironworks on the town's doorstep at Low Moor, Bowling, Birkenshaw and Shelf, Bradford soon left Halifax in its wake, and by 1840 had even replaced Leeds as the mercantile centre for worsted goods. Bradford's earliest township mill was built by Messrs. Ramsbottom, Swain and Murgatroyd in 1798. This was the home mill between Thornton Road and Little Horton Lane, later rebuilt by Richard Fawcett. The size and scale of Bradford's mills increased throughout the 19th century as more processes became mechanised. Barker End Mill was built in 1820 for William and James Garnett as a spinning and weaving mill. Following the mechanisation of combing in 1845, Titus Salt centralised all three processes under one roof in his huge manufactory at Saltaire. In 1870, Samuel Cunliffe Lister erected a vast and imposing mill at Manningham, covering 16 acres of floor area, and dominated by a 250-foot chimney resembling the campanile of San Marco in Venice. From here, Lister manufactured silk velvet from silk waste and introduced a whole new line of fabrics. Since 1830, German merchants, as the worsted industry's biggest buyers, had begun to move their businesses closer to the seat of worsted manufacture, leaving Leeds and Wakefield for Bradford. Several Germans founded export warehouses in the Leeds Road area after 1860, hence the name New Germany, later Little Germany. This precinct of piecemeal speculative warehouse buildings is very much intact today, rich in architectural features and materials, a jewel in Bradford Council's tourism crown at the turn of the millennium. The last 2 decades of the 19th century were years of falling profits and deflation caused by problems of wool supply, changing fashions, backward design, and severe overseas competition. During the First World War, the demands of the armed services for blankets, uniforms and so on put Bradford's mills onto full production and increased employment. The immediate post-war years, however, proved illusory, as woolen and worsted exports dropped from £139.5 million in 1920 to only £62 million in 1921. The shrinkage in world trade left Bradford with 60,000 unemployed persons, and following the Wall Street crash of 1929, the rate of unemployment in the city reached 20%, as 400 textile firms closed down between 1928 and 1932. The enforced modernisation of some textile machinery after 1920, and confronting the trade's late Victorian demons of fashion change and free trade, all brought even higher unemployment to the city in the 1930s. 35,000 Bradfordians were on the dole in July 1931. In 1945, the Bradford worsted trade had to come to terms with the new world economy, where competition was fierce and technology rapidly improving. During the 1950s, most of the innovations in textile machinery came from the continent, where investment was more readily available. Because of this, many Bradford companies were forced into specialization. For example, combing, spinning or weaving. The days of vertically structured business, which did everything from fleece to piece, were gone. Hampered by a severe labour shortage, some Bradford firms transported into their mills female workers from Rotherham and South Yorkshire, but the main solution ultimately lay with the employment of East European immigrants, and after 1955 with the employment of large numbers of immigrants from Pakistan and India. Bradford had built its reputation for worsted cloth on a plethora of small family businesses. In 1951, unprecedented prices were paid for raw wool in Sydney, Australia, and these remained high through the 1950s and 1960s. As a result, many of the small family units went to the wall, as the prescription for the industry's malady was standardized outputs and highly specialized larger units of production. Also, the pace of technological change seriously reduced the local labour market. One loom originally did 160 picks a minute, but the introduction in the 1960s of the Sulzer projectile shuttle and later the rapier meant the shuttle could cross the loom 300 times a minute. The Jacquard loom became a museum piece overnight and can be seen in the town's excellent industrial museum at Eccleshill. It was at Titus Salt's Saltaire mill that Mary Rhodes worked as a weaver.
At 14, I left school. This was 1935. And Mum took me to get a job here at Salt's mill. I started work in the winding department, winding bobbins that went in the big looms. Then, eventually, I went down the pattern aisle because I always wanted to learn to weave. Eventually, I learnt to weave, and I went onto the cloth looms. I had two looms, one weaving Air Force blue and the other a wool khaki. This was very noisy, it was very noisy, and the only communication you had with other weavers was by lip reading, which I could never do that. And the noisy looms, I think, made me talk very loud now. If an end broke and you let it weave a long time, you got pulled up before Mr. Brammer, who was a very stern boss, and he could fire you for that.
Perhaps the most beneficial development of recent years has been in the design of yarns to meet the fashion trends in markets throughout the world. The textile designer is no longer one of the backroom boys, but meets the customer direct, providing, by use of computer, colour and design themes 18 months in advance of their appearance in shop windows.
Many people have the conception that textiles is a cloth hat and clogs industry. That is totally wrong. I welcome anybody to come and have a look at our company and see the high-tech industry that it really is. The old shuttle looms were running at a speed of around 150 picks per minute. To look in our weaving shed now, you will see looms weaving a similar sort of fabrics, but at 490 picks per minute. That is 3 times the speed. And if you also couple that with the point that weavers used to only look after 3, maybe 4 looms, they now look after 10 looms. That is almost 20 to 30-fold on the production.
The raw material for these fine quality worsteds is no longer bought and sold at the Bradford Wool Exchange. The clamour and activity of change days, when the heads of small family textile firms made a special occasion of coming into Bradford to see their bank manager, top maker or solicitor, have now gone. Top makers and top merchants had well nigh disappeared by the 1960s, and the improvement in telecommunications facilitated private purchases of raw wool and signalled the demise of the Bradford Wool Exchange. Even so, wool auctions are still held at the British Wool Marketing Board's premises at Clayton. After 1920, Bradford employers paid a heavy price in unemployment and depression for their adherence to free trade and their overdependence on a single specialised worsted industry. A handful of engineering businesses were consolidated in the interwar years. The Phoenix Dynamo Manufacturing Company, with its main works at Thornbury, became part of the English Electric Company in 1918, specialising in industrial motors, control gears, and after 1936 in aircraft electrical equipment. At the former Lowmore Ironworks site, Osborne Steels Limited were in full metal production. Other engineering works included Crofts Engineers Limited. Motoring for the million was a slogan coined in 1919 when there were only 100,000 cars on Britain's roads. By 1930 the target had been reached, and by August 1939 the number of licensed car owners exceeded 2 million. By that year, motor manufacturing was the country's fourth largest employer of labour, and one Bradford firm made a small but qualitative contribution to that development. Benjamin and William Jowett began their business life as retailers of bicycles in the city centre. After completing a small order for motorcycle engines, they decided to build their first motor car in 1906. Their light 6-horsepower vehicle was in full production by 1910 and gained a good reputation, not least for hill climbing, so important in and around Bradford. During the First World War, the brothers concentrated on munitions, but afterwards moved to new premises at Idle, where production rose to nearly 100 vehicles per week by 1938. On the outbreak of war in 1939, the company turned wholly to munitions once again, and during the 5 war years it had a turnover of £5 million. After the war, old models were discontinued and there appeared the new 1.5-litre Javelin, a car which was universally well received. The 2-cylinder commercial van known as the Bradford soon made a name for itself for reliability, economy and long life. Jowett's also entered the sports car field in 1950 with the Javelin Jupiter, a 2-seater convertible designed for high speed and outstanding acceleration. The recession of the 1970s did little to assist Bradford's policy of economic diversification. Both Thorn Electrical and International Harvesters ceased production with the loss of 7,000 jobs. Between 1978 and 1981, the situation worsened when 23,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the city, 16,000 of them in textiles and engineering. By 1984, 1 in 7 Bradfordians was out of work. The broken windows at Titus Salt's magnificent mill and the empty, darkened shell of Manningham Mills were evidence enough that times were hard and rapidly changing. Slowly and gradually, Bradford has retreated from the abyss and faces the economic future with renewed confidence. The population of Bradford Borough increased from 13,264 in 1801 to 103,778 in 1851, when 60% of Bradfordians had been born beyond its boundaries. These migrants had come in search of mill work, but entered a town ill prepared for accommodating such numbers, and many were forced to make homes of cellars, vaults or shared rooms with total strangers and other families. The high rate of investment in mills, factories and machinery had meant a corresponding lack of social investment in housing and public services in the first half of the 19th century. Following the municipalisation of the town in 1847, things improved slightly with the provision of waterworks, refuse disposal and proper drains. Ancient yards and alleys were replaced by wider streets, but new regulations did little to outlaw the famous back-to-back premises of the new working class, whose growing numbers were increasingly accommodated in such homes, or in the endless rows of terraced housing often built in the shadow of the mill and close to a corner shop and public house. They provided a working class culture vivid in the memories of those who lived there.
I was born in 1922 and I lived at 39 Seymour Street, which was in Leeds Road in Bradford. We lived in what we called back-to-back houses. That was like 2 at the front, 2 at the back, and the entrance to the back houses was through a passage about 9 foot wide. And the width of the passage was because of the middens were at the back of the houses, and the middens were used for throwing all the refuse in for the 4 houses. And at either end of these middens there was the toilets, 2 at either end. The living accommodation was, as I said, they were back to back, 2 bedrooms, You walked into the room, which was a single room, which you'd call it was a living room, kitchen and a lounge all in one, as you might say, because you lived in that particular room all the time. And it would be a flagged floor. You can imagine how cold it would be in the winter time. And if you were lucky, in a bit of money, you'd buy a lino square, which would cover the flagged floor. And you'd have a tabby rug, which the mother and father had made themselves. And that would be in front of the fire, which is what we call the Yorkshire range. And the oven on the left-hand side looking at the fireplace, the fire in the middle, and on the right-hand side you had a boiler, a cast iron boiler, all built into the fireplace. And of course the heat from the fire warmed the water up in the boiler. And that was, you had a ladling can, put your ladling can in the boiler, and you took it to your sink, which was what we call the cellar head. The cellar head was at the top of the cellar steps. It would be about 4 by 4, and you had a stone sink in there, and your tap, and you only had a cold water tap. Grandmother and grandmother lived with us, so you could imagine there was 8 of us at that time when I was born in that house, in a 2-bedroom. We slept in with his mother and father, 4 in a bed.
When it was bath night, we had a big zinc bath, and that was lifted down from the wall outside and put in the living room. And there were 5 of us then getting bathed, and Kathleen and myself were the first because the lads were dirtier. And so it ended up with Thomas being last. Bless him, who was always last. And we slept together. We had this 1 bedroom, and there were 5 of us in the 1 bedroom. And in the winter time, I used to sleep in the middle because it was warmer. And in the summertime, when it was really warm, we used to put Thomas in the middle. Because, you know, you wanted your legs out of the bed a bit because it was cold. We had blankets on our beds, and a lot of children in those days, they used to put the coats on the beds at night.
By 1901, there were still over 530 examples of the infamous Victorian cellar dwellings in Bradford. And as late as 1922, 14,000 Bradfordians continued to live in 3,700 Victorian hovels of one kind or another. However, in 1907, the council replaced some of the worst slums in Westgate with the city's first council tenements at Longlands. Conventional council housing followed in Bankfoot, but this was ended abruptly by the outbreak of war in 1914. Addison's Housing Act of 1919 gave financial encouragement to corporations like Bradford to provide homes for working-class rental, and as a result of the 23,000 new homes built in Bradford between 1919 and 1939, over 10,000 were council houses on new estates at Haworth Road, Wetley Lane and Canterbury Avenue. Many of these new homes beyond the city centre were direct replacements for the back-to-back homes of the Industrial Revolution. A final surge of council housing occurred between 1950 and 1962, when over 10,000 houses and flats were built at Thorpe Edge, Byerley, Homewood and Netherlands Avenue. Elsewhere in Bradford, there were examples of fine Victorian villa residences, the homes of Bradford's affluent manufacturing middle classes and home-owning families who lived in the better-off enclaves of Little Horton Green, Manningham, Heaton and Hanover Square. By 1860, the most fashionable area of homes for the middle and employer classes, who surrounded themselves with gardens, trees and flowers, was the St Paul's Road area of Manningham. If ordinary working men and women could not afford luxury homes and gardens like this, they were never far away from pleasant environments. They were never very far away from a public park. The public park movement had begun in Bradford as early as 1863 with the provision of Peel Park as an antidote to Victorian Bradford's low moral tone. Others followed at Lister Park in 1870, Horton Park in 1878, Bowling Park in 1880, Bradford Moor in 1884. Industrialization and urbanization had done much to remove the traditional playgrounds of the lower classes. And due to a combination of growing civic pride and private philanthropy, Bradford did much to recompense this loss by the provision of municipal parks and a variety of recreations. Even so, Bradfordians did not stick fast, for they'd already begun to lay out for themselves escape routes from the clatter of the weaving shed and the bustle of the city streets. J.B. Priestley, born in Bradford in 1894, once wrote, "Bradford itself is ugly and forbidding, and yet within the easiest reach of its town hall square is some of the loveliest country in England. When you're in the town, you feel as you glance round at the hills bristling with dark chimneys that you'll never see a green field again, and yet you only have to take a tram or a bus, and you find yourself on a moor top with not a chimney in sight." One of the favourite routes out of the city was via a Manningham Lane tram to Saltaire's Victoria Road, and by way of the single-track Woodland Tramway onto Shipley Glen, Dick Hudson's and Ilkley Moor. Traditionally, retailing in Bradford was done from a number of different markets scattered across the town. We've already heard about the ancient meat market or shambles located in the triangular opening at the top of Ivegate and Kergate, and the butter market close by on the ground floor of the toll booth in Ivegate. By 1830 there were other small markets for general sales and specialised trading in fruit, vegetables and earthenware. A fruit and pottery market was located in Kergate in front of the old manor house. Fruit and vegetables were sold on the higher side of the marketplace. The green market was located on the site of Rawson Place, and behind Christchurch was the fairground and open poultry market. The shift to fixed shop retailing had begun by 1835, although many of these were mere extensions of the proprietor's house. Bradford's earliest shopping zone was in Westgate, where small, locally owned family businesses catered for Bradford's growing consumer needs in the Victorian times, but between 1870 and 1880 a number of large multi-storey shops were erected for the sale of drapery and furnishings. For example, Mrs. Couson's drapery store at the bottom of Ivegate became George Thorpe's House Furniture Emporium and one of the largest stores in Bradford. In 1814, the widow of William Brown, saddler, opened a small bow-fronted shop in Market Street selling underclothing. On her retirement in 1834, she brought into the business her son, Henry Brown, who married Betsy Muff, daughter of a timber merchant. In 1845, Henry took as his partner his brother-in-law, Thomas Muff, and thus was born Brown and Muff, drapers, tailors and hosiers. Throughout most of the 20th century, Brown Muffs became an integral part of the city centre landscape. For those who remember shopping there was a unique family atmosphere, in no small way due to the staff, who were not just employees, but almost family members, and passed on this feeling of pride and caring to their customers.
My grandfather was the managing director of Brown Muffs for over 20 years, and of course I was very closely associated within that time. I think everyone felt it was the Harrods of the North, and it was a lovely shop. A lot of very nice carpets, little bentwood chairs. Customer service was very, very important. The windows were always beautifully dressed, and there was a particularly nice one at the corner, and that was a non-reflecting window. And I imagine my grandfather got the idea for it in America when he went in either the 1920s or the early 30s. It was a very quiet shop. You went in and you felt as a child that you mustn't make a lot of noise because it was very quiet and very dignified. The fourth floor had the cafe, and the cafe was a great meeting place. Many people reserved tables each week on the same days, and one became very good friends with people that one met in the cafe. But in addition to that, there was a smoke room where many of the Bradford woolmen and businessmen met, and many deals, I'm sure, were cut over the tables in the smoke room.
Another department store beloved of Bradford's late 20th century shoppers was Busby's, destroyed by fire in 1979. By then it was Debenhams, closed and up for sale, but during several decades previously it had been Busby's department store and was held deep in affection by generations of Bradfordians. Ernest W. Busby had begun trading in general drapery from modest glass-fronted premises in Kirgate in 1908. He was later joined by his three sons, Arthur, Eric and Gerald, and in 1930 they purchased part of the Royal Arcade property in Manningham Lane. This became a major landmark on Bradford's shopping map, easily distinguished by the firm's logo of marching guards in Busby hats or bearskins.
Well, I can remember Busby's store in Bradford mostly for Father Christmas, because it was the place where the real Father Christmas had his grotto, and everybody of my age and probably a bit younger will know that that's true. I also remember as a child Charlie Byer in the cafe. He was wonderful at welcoming children in particular and customers in general. I remember my grandfather Ernest saying that he thought that that was the secret of their success, the fact that they were very friendly. They made a point of knowing their customers by name. And I can remember as a child that very friendly, warm feeling. It really was a family business, the sort of business that no longer exists in that scale. And that attracted people. They liked to feel cherished, they liked to feel welcomed, they liked there to be a good bargain when they got into the store.
Brown muffs and Busby's were not cheap, and in the days before haute cuisine, they were the places to buy foreign cheese, French wines and other overseas delicacies. For those on more modest incomes hoping to buy basic foodstuffs at reasonable prices, the co-op was a godsend. By 1935, a new cooperative emporium was built at the corner of Godwin Street and Sunbridge Road. But there were co-op stores all over Bradford. An extension down Godwin Street was added in 1963, and the premises were renamed Sunwin House. It remains a popular store with Bradford shoppers today, in spite of the influx of chain stores like Boots, Woolworths and Marks and Spencer's. However, the building closest to the hearts of Bradford's shoppers, and the one remembered with greatest affection, was the Spice Market, better known as Kirgate Market, opened by Bradford Corporation in 1872 and unfortunately knocked down by them 100 years later. This rectangular covered market with imposing entrances on all sides housed dozens of homely perimeter and island stalls selling all varieties of goods, including cut flowers from Hilda Lincoln's florist stall at the Kirgate entrance, bulbs and seeds from Badlands, second-hand books and sheet music from Fred Power's bookstall. And if you were feeling peckish, there was a wonderful choice of cosy cafes selling bacon and eggs, tripe and onions, Cornish pasty and chips. Arguably the best pie and peas in Bradford were to be tasted in the town's other market, the open-air market of John Street, opened in 1930 on the site of the Copy Quarry estate. At Dutch auctions, wide boys offered giveaway bargains of crockery, cheap jewellery and homing pigeons that had the habit of returning to their vendor. Better known as the Quack Market for its numerous herbalist stalls, most Bradfordians remember it for its smells of pie and peas al fresco. But if it's smells you're after, then who could forget the fragrant aroma of roasting coffee wafting along Tyrrell Street from the slightly faded elegance of Collinson's Cafe. Its middle-class clientele were offered 22 different blends of coffee, smart and pleasant waitresses in black dresses and white aprons, a palm court trio on a balcony outside the smokeroom, where many a wool deal was clinched. Out-of-town shopping in large supermarkets and shopping malls has become a feature of late 20th century retailing. A good example of this move from the city centre to the suburbs comes with Bradford's very own supermarket chain, Morrison's, at the Five Lane Ends shopping centre. William Morrison, egg and butter merchant, had first traded from the Bradford market in 1899. In the early 1900s, the limited company moved from market stalls to counter service. And in 1961, the firm opened their first supermarket, Victoria, in the former premises of an old cinema. With 3 checkouts, it was the first in Bradford to offer self-service and display prices on its products. This successful and go-ahead company went public in 1967, and in the year 2000 they have almost 100 stores across the country and have recently refurbished and rebuilt their original Bradford supermarket. While many of Bradford's citizens experienced real hardship in the interwar years, the city's growing salaried middle class of civil servants, managers, teachers and clerks all benefited from falling prices as their fixed salaries rose in real value and their disposable incomes allowed them to buy houses, cars and household consumer goods. Shorter working hours and holidays with pay, along with technological change and a widening of political franchise to include all men and women, facilitated leisure opportunities for everyone. Soccer became a sport for the masses in this period. 40,000 Bradfordians watched Bradford City beat Burnley in the quarter-final of the FA Cup in 1911. And supporters from 11 excursion trains were disappointed at the team's goalless draw in the final against Newcastle at Crystal Palace. The replay at Old Trafford saw City's captain Jimmy Spears head in the game's only goal. 2 years later, the city's other professional club, Bradford Park Avenue, were promoted to the Football League Division 1. Park Avenue's ground at Great Horton also became a home for Yorkshire Cricket Club and hosted huge crowds for matches against Australia and the Bank Holiday Roses game against Lancashire. Both Bradford soccer clubs had a thin time of things once they were relegated from the First Division of the Football League just after the First World War. Avenue finally dropped out of the league altogether in May 1970, while their neighbours and old enemy at Valley Parade went from strength to strength during the 1990s, finally in 1999 hauling themselves back into Premiership football after a break of 77 years. Unfortunately, the ground at Valley Parade in May 1985 was the scene of one of Britain's worst sporting disasters when fire engulfed the old wooden grandstand and claimed the lives of 56 people. On a day when the club paraded the 3rd Division Championship trophy for fans to celebrate, most Bradfordians were left haunted and mentally scarred by the events of that terrible day. Rugby league also flourished in the city after 1895, Bradford Northern finally making their mark in the game with 3 consecutive Wembley appearances in the Challenge Cup final between 1947 and 1949. More recently, the Bradford Bulls have become one of the leading teams in British Super League, renowned for their fast and open rugby and for their fanatical Odsal supporters. It was at Odsal Stadium on the night of Wednesday, the 5th of May 1954, that a record was set for the world's biggest ever crowd for a rugby league match, until 1999 that is. 102,575 people crammed into the Odsal ground that night, and Bradford Northern weren't even playing. The game between Halifax and Warrington was a replay of the Challenge Cup final, which had ended in a 4-4 draw at Wembley the previous week. Tries by Challoner and Helm saw Warrington home. Gates were open to admit coaches of late arrivals and remained open, so there were probably more present than the official attendance figures suggest. 2 young Halifax supporters, Arthur and Marlene Sharkey, recall the game and, more famously, the congestion surrounding it that night.
I remember very well the traffic building up as we got closer to Odsal Top. In fact, to the point where we had to park up at the side of the road, it must have been 2 miles short of the ground, and walk from there, along with hundreds, thousands of other people all trying to get there for the start of the game. I do remember that there were an awful lot of people about, but I don't remember feeling crushed or intimidated by the number of people that were there.
One very disturbing aspect from my own point of view was as soon as we got in, we went round the back of the stand to go on to the Northern Hospital end of the ground. That's the opposite end to Ruler Lane, where we went in. And just as we're going round the back of the stand, the old fence, it was a wooden paling fence, crashed down, and hordes of people came in from the car park, which was at the other side of the fence. And although the initial attendance was just over 100,000, the official attendance, sorry, was just over 100,000, there must have been, from a personal point of view, 20,000 people come surging through that big gap that was caused by the fence. It was covered one whole side of the ground.
One of the longest running events in Bradford's sporting calendar is the Bradford Wit Walk, which was first held in 1903, when 92 entrants left Ivegate for a 41-mile walk to York. The winner of that inaugural walk was Len Atkinson. By 1905, the race had become a circular one of 32 miles, ending in Peel Park and taking in Wharfdale and the Chevin. The best-remembered competitor when the race had become an annual Whitsuntide occasion for many Bradford families was Albert Johnson of the Sheffield Club, who won the race 9 times between 1954 and 1963. By far the most popular public entertainment after 1918 was the cinema. Between the wars, cinema-going became a habit among the prosperous working and lower middle classes, many of whom went at least once a week. For the unemployed and poorer sections of Bradford society, going to pictures became an occasional but longed-for treat. Beneath the flickering screen, audiences at Bradford's many cinemas, 42 by 1939, could forget the depression and unemployment, at least until the national anthem was played, and escape to a celluloid world of dashing heroes and beautiful heroines at a cost of only 6p for adults and half price for children.
We went to the Penny Rush Saturday mornings. All the kids, you could sit anywhere you liked in the cinema for a penny, which is a 1p today, and you'd queue outside that cinema until it was ready to open, about 10 o'clock in the morning. And you can imagine when you opened the door, there was Charge of the Light Brigade at best seats, and everybody, once it got set in, silent films, of course, and you'd have a woman playing the piano, and she'd play her music appertaining to what, if it was a war story, you can imagine her banging away at the piano. If it was a love story, she'd be playing the Cowboys and Indians. They were nearly all cowboys and Indians in them days, and she'd be playing all sorts of loud music, and of course we'd be cheering and shouting out, "He's behind you!" you know, and all that kind of thing. And
the first talkie film was shown at Darley Street Savoy Cinema in March 1929.
I remember going to see the first talking film in 1929. I was 5 years old, and I went with my mother, auntie and sister. And it was a very moving picture and made everybody cry. And as we were coming home on the tram, the conductor looked at us and said, "I know where all you've been." And he said, "You've been to see the film at the Savoy Theatre." And I suppose every night he'd have folk with tearful eyes and red eyes.
Picture Saturday night, I mean, that was a big night. Saturday night, you got your best suit on, which you weren't allowed to wear during the week. In fact, we used to go, if we went to pictures during the week with the local pictures, we used to go in as overalls, what we'd wore during the mill. And Saturday night was a dressed up night with the starch collars and there's brill cream on, fancy dress, best suit, and we'd go to the Ritz or the Odeon, New Victoria, 6p, the best seats.
The New Victoria Cinema was an absolutely wonderful place. It was very grand indeed, and it was a great treat to be taken there. I remember being taken to children's films there during the war. And I think the nice thing about it was that it had the most wonderful theatre organ, which I'm sure I remember was called the Mighty Wurlitzer. It was very much an occasion to go to the New Victoria, or the New Vic as it was known, as it was so much grander than any of the small cinemas in the suburbs that we also went to. There was a ballroom, it was a very large complex, there was a ballroom, and in fact my husband and I met in the ballroom when we were 15 years old at a Wool Association dance. But I think there was a resident orchestra there.
Dancing, well, of course, there was 3 or 4 dance halls in Bradford. There was the Textile Hall, there was Gledhill's, which was run by a man and wife. This is in the 30s, and amazingly, Gledhill's, they had pillars. It was pillars all around the dance floor, so you could bump into them. You could bump into these pillars when you were twirling your girlfriend round or whatever, and bounce off these pillars many a time.
During the late 1950s and 1960s, cinemas like the Gaumont fulfilled a dual role, acting as venues for the new icons of popular music, like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, and before them, in 1958, for Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Bradfordians made a huge contribution to both world wars, and the city felt the impact of both wars socially and economically. Bradford was one of the most vibrant and upbeat cities of the Edwardian era. That Edwardian confidence and optimism were wiped out on the 4th of August 1914 with the declaration of war on Germany. The flood of volunteers outside the town's barracks at Bellevue led to the formation of a Citizens' Army League, which permitted Bradford to raise, feed and train its own battalions until the War Office was able to receive them into the regular army. It was officially known as the 16th Battalion, Prince of Wales' own West Yorkshire Regiment. Later, with a 2nd Battalion, the 18th, they came to be known as the Bradford Pals. Of the 770 men of the 16th Battalion who went over the top on the 1st of July 1916, 515 were reported killed, seriously wounded or missing by the 3rd of July. The 18th Battalion's casualties were also 70% in the carnage of the Somme. The Bradford Daily Telegraph on the 7th of July 1916 informed its readers, under a headline of "Paying the Price," of the terrible significance of what had happened to the city's menfolk. The war has laid a terribly heavy hand on our city in the last 2 or 3 days. Scores of homes have suddenly been plunged into grief, and amongst them are many well-known families. Bradford now realizes to the full what it is to be at war. In the days following, the newspaper columns were taken up by photographs of the local dead and missing. It was during the war years that Bradford experienced a most dramatic disaster. Just after 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Monday, the 21st of August 1916, a small fire started close to 30,000 pounds of picric acid. The fire spread quickly and led to a series of explosions which lasted 2 days and culminated in a huge detonation of a nearby gasometer, killing 2 firemen from Odsal Station and 4 from Nelson Street. In all, 339 people were killed and 60 were injured. Following so soon after the decimation of the Pals battalions, few Bradfordians ever forgot where they were or what they were doing when Low Moor Works went up. In 1939, for the second time in one generation, Bradfordians were forced into war against Germany in the shape of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialists. This time, with the homeland itself under threat from the bombs of the Luftwaffe, it became a people's war. Bradford, however, escaped lightly from the Blitz. The city was bombed only 5 times, with few casualties and relatively little physical damage. More sustained bombing occurred on the night of the last day in August 1940, when over 100 bombs seriously damaged several buildings in the city, killing 1 person. That night, the Odeon Cinema received a direct hit less than 15 minutes after the audience had left the building after the last show. Many people remember the destruction of Lingard's department store in Godwin Street, which was ripped apart by a bomb and gutted by fire. The final raid on Bradford on the 14th of March 1941 was the heaviest, when almost 600 bombs hit the city, causing minimal damage. More serious, 2 months later, a German bomber crash-landed on cottages in Idle and burned out, killing 5 civilians and seriously injuring 5 others. That was the total of Bradford's direct involvement with the battlefront. Anxieties about bombing from the onset of the war led to plans for the evacuation of children, expectant mothers, the walking disabled and under 5s. Parents were left to make their own decisions, and many could not face to be parted from their youngsters. But several hundred children did leave Bradford, and among them was Mary Gilmartin.
We set off from home, as usual going to school. We walked down to St Mary's School on Jermyn Street, and we were met there by the teachers, and they ticketed us and called our names and so on. And then we walked in a crocodile from school down Church Bank to Foster Square Station. There seemed to be hundreds of kiddies moving about, and it seemed like an adventure at the time. We hopped on the train and we were on for quite some time, but all we were doing was going from Bradford to Bingley. We got off the train and marched in a crocodile there to, I think it was a schoolroom, really. It was a big room anyway, and we were all there, and there were ladies there calling names out and putting us in little groups. And I'd been told I mustn't separate myself from Thomas, and he clung hold of me and I was clinging hold of him, and we stood in the groups that we were supposed to be going to people's houses if somebody had said 4 or 2 or whatever. We seemed to be there for a long time, because although some had said they wanted 2 girls or whatever, those with 2 girls, they went off and were taken to houses. But then there were some, like myself, who were waiting to be what you'd call chosen, I suppose. And I remember there was one lady, one girl there, and she had 3 brothers, and she was there for ages and ages, and in the end they had to split up.
The official end to the hostilities of the war in Europe came on the 8th of May 1945, and thousands of people packed the open area in front of Bradford Town Hall, singing and dancing in wild jubilation. The crowd included several hundred Polish airmen and Ukrainian refugees who'd been adopted by the city since 1940 and who decided to remain in their new homeland after the war. It was the MP for Bradford, W.E. Forster, who'd pioneered the first Effective Education Act in 1870, which set up local authority provision of schooling in the shape of school boards. By 1914, socialist reformers like Margaret Macmillan were on the move in Bradford by providing school medical examinations, school meals, and school baths. Macmillan's recommendations of 1893 that the city initiate a system of nursery education was finally given the go-ahead by national statute in 1918, and 2 years later, nursery schools were opened for the first time in Bradford at Princeville and St Anne's Broomfields. The progressive quality of the city's educational policies between the wars was held back by the authorities' chronic lack of money from the rates. Only after the landmark legislation of the 1944 Education Act and a supportive Labour government was Bradford able to realise its ambitions of the 1916 Charter and provide secondary education for all, free, compulsory and without selective or competitive entry. Even though there were no fees to be paid, education beyond the age of 14 was an expensive business, with an immediate loss of the pupil's earnings to the family income. In 1929, 2,813 pupils in Bradford qualified for secondary schools, but only 840 took their places. Despite dissent from many quarters, the revolutionary changes went ahead. There were to be more selective secondary schools for both boys and girls at Bellevue, Carlton, Grange, Hanson and Thornton Grammar School, in addition to central schools at Priestman, Gregory School for Girls and Foster School for Boys. The Bradford Boys and the Bradford Girls Grammar Schools continued to receive the brightest scholars from the city's elementary schools, providing their parents wished them to go there. Doris Ratcliffe, the daughter of a Labour councillor and later a socialist councillor in her own right as Doris Birdsall, attended the Hanson Secondary School for Girls.
Well, my first school was Usher Street, which I suppose in terms of today would be called a downtown school, really. And I remember it so clearly. The headmistress was a Miss Abbs, typical schoolmistress of, head teacher of the time. And when it came to the scholarship, as we called it then, it was a very fraught time for me because I knew that my father would really take a very dim view of it if I didn't pass it. And I sat there sort of with a beating heart, and when the scholarship, the results were announced, and there was just myself and a boy who'd passed. So the relief of it was tremendous, and I could go home and say, I've passed. So that was great. And then I went to Hanson Girls.
As early as 1948, the Bradford Education Authority was committed to the introduction of a system of comprehensive education. 11 schools across the city, each with a 10-form entry of 300 pupils. By 1960, 5 new secondary schools had been built, but not on comprehensive lines. The transition to a complete system of comprehensivization was dogged by local political squabble, as the Conservatives vigorously opposed the loss of selection at the age of 11. Eventually, at a crucial council meeting in October 1963, Councillor Newby proposed the abolition of the 11 plus in Bradford, and the motion was carried by 44 votes to 27. Doris Ratcliffe, as Councillor Doris Birdsall, was in the council chamber.
We'd fought an election, and the main policy, of course, was that we would abolish selection, the 11 plus as was going. And the morning after, on the Friday morning, we actually went in when the ex-chair of Conservatives was there and sort of formally handed control over to us. And then we had a meeting with the director, who was Albert Spalding, and told him that selection was going and that it would go within a year in the September, that we would be starting a system of comprehensive education. No selection, that was gone. And the excitement right throughout the education department was unbelievable. We worked them to death. Looking back on it now, I wonder how we dared do it so quickly.
By 1880, Bradford was at the centre of a railway network, albeit one operated by several different companies. Continued line extensions opened new suburban stations and allowed the wealthier citizens to live out in the rural outskirts of the city, in Bingley, Ilkley, Skipton and even Morecambe. Bradford's 2 terminus railway stations were reduced to 1 in 1973, with the demolition of the Exchange station, formerly of the Great Northern Railway Company. To replace it, a transport interchange was erected in Bridge Street. It was the tram, however, which had the greatest influence on the lives of the majority of Bradfordians at the turn of the 20th century, and here the corporation played an important part in the movement of people within and around the conurbation. A municipal steam tramway had been introduced as early as 1882, and by 1907 electric tramways linked all the out-townships within the city centre. The Bradford City Transport Department expanded into one of the corporation's largest trading concerns in an age when most people travelled by public transport, bicycle or by foot. In June 1911, the council pioneered a trackless trolleybus service between Leicesterdike and Dudley Hill, and others quickly followed. In 1923, improved types of trolleybus began to replace tram services, and they in turn, after 1930, came under competition from the motorbus. Between them, the trolleybus and the motorbus meant the days of the tram were numbered, although both forms of transport operated throughout the Second World War. By 1960, the total route mileage of corporation buses was 93 services, and generally speaking ran from Foster Square, serving one half of the city, and Town Hall Square, serving the other half. However, it's the corporation trolleybus that's remembered with the greatest fondness by many Bradfordians today. Bradford had been the first local authority to use this form of transport. Trolleybuses were ideal for the city's hilly terrain, and they were clean and quiet. The corporation was so committed to the trolleybus, it began to build its own from the Thornbury Works during the First World War, and continued to do so well into the 1950s. They were problematic in that they could not overtake, and at rush hour tended to operate in convoys. They depended upon electric power from overhead cables, which had a habit of separating from the bus, particularly on bad bends or corners. At that point, the conductor had to dismount and use a long pole with a hook to reconnect the bus. Also, most people will have received the mild electric shock experienced when they first boarded the bus, earthing the built-up static. Happy days. Despite these minor inconveniences, the trolleybus was the mainstay of Bradford's public transport system for most of the 20th century. After 61 years' service, the council decided in favour of the motorbus in 1972, and hundreds turned out to say farewell to the last trolley as it made its final journey to Thornton. The motor car became the symbol of the 20th century's consumer society after 1945. As early as 1947, there were 2 million cars on the roads of Britain, and in that year, the city's new engineer and surveyor, Stanley Gordon Wardley, announced his blueprint for Bradford's future. His intentions were to improve major road links to Leeds in the east, Manchester in the west, and the rest of Britain to the south. Business, shopping and leisure were to be separated in distinct zones, and there was no place for living in the town centre. Wardley's revolutionary plan for a new city with provision for a continuous self-regulating flow of traffic by means of an inner and outer ring road through roads and numerous roundabouts was acclaimed as visionary at the time. Wardley in fact became the scapegoat for Bradford's later architectural heritage. In reality, his plan was to knock the heart out of the Victorian city, whose interesting buildings were sacrificed in the rush to modernity. The scheme demolished a good deal of the historic core of Bradford, including Kirkgate Market, Swan Arcade and the Mechanics' Institute. It was not until 1972 that Bradford was finally linked into the national motorway system at the Staygate roundabout on Rewley Lane by means of the M606. Bradfordians have experienced and had to adapt to a great many of the changes which the 20th century has thrust their way. These have come at an increasingly fast rate since the 1950s. In 1974, Bradford's history as an independent city came to an end when the reorganisation of local government made Bradford an enlarged metropolitan district in the West Yorkshire Metropolitan County area. Traditional and fiercely independent communities like Baildon, Bingley, Ilkley, Keighley and Shipley were forcibly made part of the new Bradford. Meanwhile, the traditional centre of the city experienced a second phase of redevelopment and reconstruction, with the erection of the police headquarters and law courts, a new hotel, a transport interchange, and the conversion of the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. The modern city of the 20th century has now overrun the ancient and historic core of Ivegate, Westgate and Kergate, and takes Bradford and its people into the third millennium.